Our first reading this morning is Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. God then said to Noah and his family, I hereby establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, birds, cattle, earth's wildlife, everything that came out of the ark, everything that lives on the earth. I hereby establish my covenant with you. All flesh will never again be swept away by the waters of the flood. Never again will a flood destroy all the earth. God said, here is the sign of the covenant between me and you and every living creature for ageless generations. I set my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, my bow will appear in the clouds. Then I will remember the covenant that is between me and you and every kind of living creature, and never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all flesh. Whenever my bow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all living things on earth.
Our second reading is Rainbow Connection, normally heard sung by Saint Kermit. Why are there so many songs about rainbows and what's on the other side? Rainbows are visions, but only illusions, and rainbows have nothing to hide. What's so amazing that keeps us stargazing, and what do we think we might see? Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. So we've been told, and some choose to believe it. I know they're wrong, wait and see. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. Not so ancient words for our current consideration.
Well, it has been a very long week. So many of you have lost, at least here in Texas, have lost power, have lost water. It's just been a brutal week here. And I know that you probably have people from all over the country calling to check and make sure you were okay. So as much as Texas likes to think it can go it alone, I think there's a lesson this week that we need to take to heart. But the reason I'm saying all that is we're looking today at the story of Noah and the flood. And after this week, that may not seem like that big of an ordeal. You may look at this story and say, well, at least he had running water. Obviously, this is a children's story from long ago, older even than Israel. It goes into, you find versions of it in Babylonian literature, but nobody knows where a lot of these ancient stories come from, which is what makes them such treasures. They're huge truths about life put in little children's stories that we can remember. And in times like this, maybe there's a lesson we can learn from it. What I always look for when it comes to these ancient stories is how does that particular culture change the story? And the Jewish story is different from the Babylonian story, primarily in that they add the rainbow part. And that's the assurance that there's not going to be divine violence. Not that there ever was, but obviously some kind teacher is trying to soothe some frightened heart to know that if things are seem to be going astray, it's not an angry God. Karl Marx saw religion as an escape from the kind of struggles we've had this week. Stories of a rainbow where, like in the Rainbow Connection, you have that sense there's something beyond it that you have to find. There's a pot of gold, or songs somewhere over the rainbow. Birds fly over the rainbow, why, oh, why can't I? Those kinds of uses of rainbow imagery feel like they're calling away from life and the struggles that we have. I would say quite the opposite. They call us deeper into life. But let's listen to what Karl Marx has to say. And I think he's not as angry as religion, I think, as it sounds. He is passionate for humankind, and he doesn't want religion to lightly heal the kinds of challenges that we have. He said, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless conditions. He says it's the opium of the people. That doesn't mean a hallucinogen. It means something that numbs the pain without necessarily healing the injury. He said the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for the real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore an embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that human beings should continue to bear that chain without fantasy or conclusion, but so that they may throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. Now, what I primarily hear in that is a passion that Marx has, that religion not become a way of us making peace with the conditions that afflict humankind. I don't know if he's saying that religion can't help, but I believe it can. And I believe that there are times when that rainbow we see through our tears, that halo that he talks about, is how we remember that even in its brutality, that life has beauty and meaning. And I don't think that's escapism. I think that's how we keep our human hearts intact. And when we forget that, I think something very bad happens to us. I made a mistake this week. I did a post on Rush Limbaugh. And my intention, looking back, was pretty naive. I was thinking what I'd do is recognize his humanity, but then show how brutal his words were to parts of our human family. And there were a lot of people that couldn't get past that idea of recognizing the humanity of Rush Limbaugh. They're so hurt, so frightened, so traumatized that there were postings on my Facebook post, which I'm trying to make respectful, that consisted of nothing but name calling and things about using the bathroom on Rush Limbaugh's grave. And I realize how the real dividing line isn't liberal or conservative, because we can all get caught in hatred. I think if you used algebra and just reversed the names, my Facebook page looked like a Trump rally, just with the names reversed. And I think that our little children's lesson today is an incredibly important reminder that however traumatized we are, however much we think violence and cruelty is the answer, to remember that violence is always the storm. Hatred is always the storm. And that love is always the boat, is always the ship that we're looking for. Because I don't care how liberal, conservative, nice you are, we forget that. I think all of us come to think sometimes that what the world needs is for the good bullies to beat up the bad bullies. And I think that's just human nature. And I don't think we're bad for having that be our first impulse. But I think stories like this are trying to remind us that our first impulse is very understandable and we should express it and feel it and all of that. But also there's a better way. And when we act and speak out of cruelty and hatred, we end up with the world that nobody wants. And in Genesis, the story of the storm is the cruelty. From the very beginning, violence is the problem. Started with the two brothers, where one gets jealous of the other. In this case, before the storm, God is looking at the world and sees the violence and is heartbroken. Now, again, this is a very human idea of God, a very not childlike, but childish idea of what God is like. A tantrum thrower, forgets things, doesn't know certain things, repents of mistakes. And in this story, God looks out at the world and says, I repent of having made human beings. Now, in ancient cultures, you understand there's a kind of humor here. There's a kind of whimsical nature to it, where you're not really saying that the divine source of all is like this. But that's what life feels like sometimes. And if you don't tell those stories, it's really hard to get the heart working. I was talking to a member of St. Andrews years and years ago. Mickey Andrews was his name. And he went to live with the Hopi Indians. And it was life altering for him, but he didn't know what to do. All this wisdom, all this indigenous, just the genius that was there. And then coming back to this culture, he just didn't know how to handle that. So one day he was talking about how Americans are turning on one another and how capitalism is just destroying everything that matters. And I believe, if my memory serves me, it was a medicine man. I think his name was Running Bear. I could be mistaken. But he said that when the original Americans, the indigenous people, went to war, the reason they put makeup on their face was to realize that they were going in an altered state. There was a kind of necessary insanity. In order to protect themselves, they had to enter into this cruelty in order to survive. And they had a ceremony where they put this face paint on, war paint. And then they would go do what they needed to do. And when they came back, they took the face paint off and went through a ceremony where they returned back to their own hearts, to nonviolence. And what he said was the United States after World War II, we put on the face paint, but we never took it back off again. What we tried to do is rechannel those energies that we'd used for war for industry. And so there was a kind of a violence behind the ambition. And what he said was that there's an insanity that we have to step out of. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that's the wisdom that we're looking for. That's the wisdom that I think our little story today is trying to tell us, that we have to look at these sorts of things almost like algebra, where you have X plus Y equals Z. Instead of knowing that one of them is Biden and one of them is Trump, and one of them is your favorite candidate, you put a mask on each of the people and just say, who's trying to communicate, who isn't, who's working for justice, who isn't. I think what the story in Genesis is trying to talk about is the collapse of these civilizations, these empires. And I think what we're seeing in our own time that we don't want to take in, we do not want to see. It's not just that the grid in Texas is caving in, but capitalism is caving in. It can't help it. It's not built on what human beings need. It doesn't make precautions based on what human beings need. It makes its decisions on profit. And humankind has suffered under that cruelty long enough. It's time to turn the page. I feel sorry for Rush Limbaugh. I find that a tragic story that somebody would spend their life and make hundreds of millions of dollars on ridiculing the oppressed. And that came across as tough. How traumatized would you have to be for that to sound tough? So we're the ones, we were looking at Dorothy Day today in Sunday school, and as she talks about a revolution of the heart, it's like we look at the world, we feel overwhelmed. It feels like there's nothing we can do. But our story is telling us something different. First, we have to realize that the storm is the violence. And we're not going to find a way of getting the violence to work for us. The second thing is to realize that love is the ship, it's the boat. That when we struggle to make it a better world, we can't know beforehand what we need to do or not do. There are times, I believe, where violence is the only way to avoid even greater violence. But hatred is never a helpful energy. Dehumanizing another person, calling another person names. We go into a kind of war insanity. We think that because we've called somebody a name, we've refuted them. And you can see that probably in everybody but yourself. But to realize that that's human nature, to think if I've knocked over the chessboard, I won. And that feels really good for a couple minutes, and then it feels really, really bad. This story of the ship going through the storm is very fundamental. Certainly it is with Judaism, but with Christianity, a lot of times you'll see the roof of the church looks like an inverted boat. And that's talking about the church is designed to go through the storm. And to realize that sometimes you can't save the whole world. Sometimes things are too sick. And that's when the Bible talks about the remnant. It's you prepare an oasis. Daniel used that word in the welcoming time. When you're surrounded by cruelty, to have a community of kindness that's dedicated to kindness is incredibly important. You may have no idea the work that people from St. Andrews have been doing to help unsheltered people during this time, or members that took in other members that they knew needed help. It didn't get the storm off the earth, but it made the storm survivable. And the external storms are expressions of the internal storm, because the storm that hurts the heart more than anything is hatred and bitterness. That energy, the waters of that storm, that chaos, hurts us in a way that nothing external quite can. It's understandable that we get traumatized. It's understandable that we want to label people. We want things to be simple. We want it to be good over here, bad over there. But I think our story is saying just remember that's the storm. That is not the vessel that will get you out of this. In the Babylonian version of the story, there's a part that I love enormously, because I'm a nerd, as you have probably figured out by now. But in that version of the story, the Noah figure has to tear his house down to build the boat. And I think that's the level of radical insight that we need. We have got to restructure our lives away from the property rights, the violence, the colonial mindset, the patriotism that is so short-sighted, it doesn't care about the rest of the world, or international law, or the Geneva Convention, or the Nuremberg trials. We have to let the revolution start in our own heart, and then to find a community that's willing to go through that revolution as well, that can help remind each other that as tempting as it is to choose hatred and dehumanizing, it's so hard not to do that. Sometimes individually we can't help it. We can help each other not do that. We can restore each other to balance, to kindness, and to the only way our hearts can be joyful. Our joy comes out of that peace, out of that compassion. The final part of the story, again, is the most important part in terms of the punchline, because the rainbow isn't in the earlier versions. And to me, that always means that's what the rabbi is trying to teach us here, that there's always hope, that we're never living in a world where we're being punished by an angry God, This isn't escapism. This isn't saying there's something on the other side of the rainbow. It's not saying there's a pot of gold if you believe enough. It's saying the rainbow itself expresses something about who you are. It's a manifestation of something. As tempting as it may be to try to get to the other side of the rainbow, there is no other side of the rainbow. We've got to live under the rainbow. And the truth is, a rainbow, it can only be seen from a certain angle. And so trying to get to another angle to see it's really about, we lose the rainbow too. And the rainbow is a manifestation, I think, of a truth. I don't think God used a bow, but I do think using that symbol helps us understand that sometimes life is so painful that the only thing that makes it worth living is being open to the beauty that is there. And I think that's realizing that both of those are true. Life can be brutally hard and unfair, but is always beautiful. There's always beauty somewhere. Every drop has a rainbow in it. We just can't see it. That rainbow is everywhere. And it's just that angle of vision and the little drop of water makes that beauty visible to us. But we can live in that beauty all the time. And as much as I understand what Marx is trying to say, that religion can be escapist, I don't think it has to be escapist. I think sometimes seeing that rainbow through our tears is what keeps us going, is what helps us to choose kindness when those around us are being cruel, not giving up on beauty. It's not necessarily whipping ourselves into caring and feeling and all of that kind of thing, because those sometimes are not there. Sometimes we cannot feel compassion. But when we won't let go of beauty, it can keep our heart open. It was Maya Angelou who said, try to be a rainbow in someone's cloud. And I kind of think that's what happened this week in so many ways. While we're having this service, Lighter Loads has been out there trying to serve people, give them showers. And a lot of you took in friends and neighbors. Some of you had to shiver through the cold. But if you're here, that means you made it, which is very good. So I think our story today is not saying to get beyond the rainbow to some prize that's there. It's not saying that you shouldn't feel anger and bitterness and trauma, and even if it may even be hatred sometimes. But to recognize that's not where your home is. To realize that violence never makes us feel that good, even if we win the argument, even if we beat the opponent, it doesn't feel good to be a bully. And then also the peace of mind that comes from realizing that even when you can't save the whole world in your place and time, that saving the remnant, building an oasis, finding other people who will center their lives around kindness and beauty can make all the difference in the world. And then finally, reminding each other that there's always something beautiful there, some way, someplace, sometime, can help us get through times like this. And our little story, so childish and so wonderful, reminds us always that violence and hatred are the storm, and that love is our vessel, is our boat, is our home. Well, that's my study of the text.